our annual event on the Eurobarometer result for Ireland. Eurobarometer is a survey which is taken all over Europe, and what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at the results from the Irish people who are surveyed in Ireland. So my name is Tim Hayes. I am the head of communication here at the representation. I'm joined by Luke Leaker, who is the managing director of Behaviour and Attitude, which is a polling company, and it's the polling company that did the work for us here in Ireland. So Luke has got 25 years experience in doing surveys, and he previously worked for TNS and RBI. He also worked for Lansdowne Market Research. He's a 9-time winner of the Excellence in Research Award from the Marketing Society of Ireland. So that's pretty spectacular, in fact. So this is the second year that Luke has done this report for us here in Ireland. He's actually working on a subcontract basis to Cantor. Cantor are the public company that does it in the rest of Europe, but Luke does it here in Ireland for us. So what we're going to do over the next 20 minutes or so is Luke is going to present the results from the Irish study, and then we are going to throw the floor open to questions. So people that are here can question, and also the people who are watching online can ask questions, and you can do that using Slido. So it's slido.com, and the code for this event is 3641968. That's 3641968. That code is in the description box for those people watching online anyway. So after Luke's presentation, we see what questions come in from the floor, what questions come from Slido, and I think that we should probably be finished in a little bit less than an hour. So Luke, it's over to you, please, if you present your results for us. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody, from a nice rainy Dublin. So we're delighted to present, I suppose, the Eurobarometer 98 public opinion study. It's a national report for Ireland. Just to give you a little bit of introduction for those not familiar, and I'm sure most people are familiar listening in today. As Tim mentioned, it's a long series of reports dating back to 1974, essentially, and we cover public opinion and attitudes towards the European Union across a range of issues. It could be economic issues, attitudes to the European Union, the direction Europe is taking, as well as trust in the EU institutions and indeed media as well as that. So we're going to be presenting the key findings from Ireland. We'll make some comparisons to the EU 27, just to demonstrate, I suppose, the Irish relationship and where Ireland sits attitudinally compared to the rest of Europe, which is quite interesting on that. Yeah. So we collected the data between the 12th of January and the 6th of February. Behaviour and Attitudes undertook the fieldwork on behalf of Cantor. It's a face-to-face CAPI, computer-aided personal interviewing, anachronism, methodology of that, multi-stage random probability sample, and just over 1,000 adults aged 15 plus are interviewed, which is representative of the total population aged 15 plus in Ireland. So today we're going to present, I suppose, 3 core themes. There's a whole report, obviously, set of tables. You can peruse at your heart's content a little bit later, but we're going to focus on 3 key themes. One is the trust in European institutions, and I suppose the European direction for the future. We'll talk about some important contextual issues, such as local and indeed EU concerns from an Irish public perspective. We'll obviously get the reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Look a little bit in terms of political leanings as well. A lot of discourse around that in the media at the moment, and to see where we sit versus our EU 27 average. And obviously topical is energy supply and people's reactions to energy supply and where we might go in the future in that. And the final section is around media, and we'll talk a little bit about the sources, I suppose, in terms of media, but also in terms of trust as well. Okay, so talk a little bit about, first off, the trust in European institutions and EU direction for the future. One of my favourite charts, I love pulling this chart up every year on that, and I suppose it's, first of all, we ask people to essentially, we want to gauge, I suppose, how positive, neutral or negative they are towards the EU. So does the EU conjure up, I suppose, a positive or negative or neutral image for the Irish public in that? And obviously you can see this tracked back over time. We've certain time points as well on the graph, so we can see in terms of different factors, what's happening out there that we're at a certain time. And I suppose what's interesting is we see there 74% of the Irish population basically say the EU conjures up a positive image for them, which is extremely high overall in that, and extremely high compared to the EU average, which is 45%. So we are Irish public shows, I suppose, significantly more positivity towards the EU compared to the European average and that overall. And you can see, I suppose, which is kind of interesting is when you look at COVID-19 in terms of the pandemic, and that there was an uplift around that time, and we sort of maintained that we're actually up a little bit more in the latest wave and that. So very much Ireland leading in this regard and that. And look, the EU is seen as a positive force in Ireland. Look, Irish public see it offering economic benefits, its access to markets, funding for infrastructure, promoting peace, stability, and so forth. And that. So there's a number of different elements that would feed into that overall, which is very positive. Then we turn to, I suppose, trust, and to the degree they have trust in certain institutions and that. So first of all, in terms of the European Union itself there, but also then the various constituent parts of different institutions and that. So in the bars you have the Ireland figures, and then just below in terms of line of figures you have the EU 27 level on that. So I suppose what we're seeing overall, year on year, very solid in terms of the scores overall in terms of trust. So the Irish public much more trusting of European institutions compared to the EU average. So you have 61% would trust the European Union, for example, compared to 47% of the EU 27 on average trusting the European Union. And then I suppose for various ones, if you take just the European Parliament there, 61% of the Irish public would trust the European Parliament compared to just under half of the EU 27 on average in that. So Irish people, look, they have trust in the democratic process of the EU, transparency, ability, and the accountability of the EU institutions, and and this contributes to this trust, undoubtedly, and that. So EU institutions, they're seen as democratic and accountable, and that overall in that. So and they represent, I suppose, the interest of the EU and indeed Irish citizens, and that's what the reason really behind these figures. Then we turn to, I suppose, the degree and how well informed Irish people are about European matters, and we compare this to, I suppose, a range of other countries, obviously the other countries there, and we see the average obviously there for the EU 27 average there at 35 and that. So I suppose, look, we see the Irish public feel very well informed about European matters, 63%, compared to the European average of about 35% on that. So significantly better informed on that, and only pipped, I suppose, by Luxembourg, which is the highest ranking country, so places the Irish public in second place and that overall on that. So look, we have a political culture that's generally supportive of EU membership and integration and that, and I suppose this culture, I suppose, emphasises, I suppose, the importance of engagement with the EU and indeed its benefits and that, so it encourages a high level of interest in the EU and EU affairs and that. And look, political parties are generally quite pro EU as well, which contributes, I suppose, to a greater, I suppose, awareness of EU issues and amongst the population and that as well. And just great sources of information. We'll talk a little bit about that, about the EU a little bit later on that. So then, I suppose, about the future, when we look at thinking about the future and to what extent people are optimistic or not about the future of the EU and where do we stand overall in that. What's encouraging, I suppose, much like we saw last year on that, significant proportion, over 4 and 5 of the Irish citizens are optimistic about the future of the EU and its direction and that. And look, our optimism, I suppose, remains significantly higher, I suppose, compared to the EU 27 average, which is about 3 and 5, and that overall on that. So it ranks us, I suppose, first place amongst the EU 27 states and that, And we saw a similar pattern last year overall in terms of our ranking. So that's the first section. We felt then it was important just to talk a little bit about contextual issues. And first off, we want to look at the most important factors or issues facing Ireland at the moment. Yeah? So in the blue bar essentially is, and relates to the blue figures, relates to obviously the Irish public's view this year in 2023 in terms of what are the important factors, and in terms of the greyish bar is 2022 in terms of last year, and you can see where you see up and down versus last year in the greyish colours there. I suppose one of the interesting things what we see is the two most important issues facing Ireland at the moment centre around housing and I suppose rising prices, inflation, the cost of living, which probably is not surprising given what's happening at the moment of that, you know. So they are the two most important issues coming through in that. And as we can see, I suppose inflation, actually rising prices, has settled back a bit from last year. We'll talk a little bit about maybe that later on. But still, it is one of the top two issues overall. Health, obviously, is another issue that is in third place. And then energy supply comes in fourth place in that. What is interesting is immigration actually has risen. It's still at a low level, you know, in terms of Ireland. So there's a lot of chatter and discourse around that in terms of media and that, but it's still at a low level. But it has actually risen, yeah, just as an issue that people are particularly think there's an issue that's facing Ireland at the moment in that, you know. So what's interesting is when we switch and we talk to the Irish public about the most important, or the two most important issues facing the EU at the moment in that. And what do we see on that, you know? So what we see, I suppose, again, we see rising prices, inflation, cost of living. They think in terms of the EU is a key issue, albeit that's settling back just a little bit, but still a top issue. Then we see the international situation coming through, so that outward-looking international situation. And interesting, immigration here comes up a lot stronger than it did last year as a challenge for the EU amongst the Irish public. So their view of it and that. So a lot bigger and comes up in terms of third place on that. And then we have energy supply coming in fourth place and that overall on that, followed by obviously environment and climate change and that. So different perspective, yeah, whether we're inward looking or in terms of we're outward looking, slightly different context on that. Then we turned and we asked about the level of satisfaction with the response to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine by, I suppose, obviously the European Union, first off in the first bar, and then to what extent, you know, in terms of the Irish government's response and that, in terms of how satisfied they were overall in that. And I suppose in the grey box there we summarise it, so you have 3/4 essentially are satisfied, I suppose, with both, I suppose, the European Union's response, but also in terms of the Irish government's response as well overall. So very, very high levels overall of that. And that's compared to, I suppose, just over half of, I suppose, the EU 27 on average satisfied with their own government's response, or indeed the European Union's response in that. So Ireland a lot more satisfied overall with both parties' response in that. Then we talk a little bit about, and we thought it would be interesting just to follow on from this, to talk a little bit about people's leaning in terms of political matters, left or right, and there's a lot of chatter and debate about this. And we asked people on a scale where they sort of position themselves overall, and we just felt it was interesting, just given, I suppose, a lot of the discussion out there where people are at and how it compares to the EU 27 on average in that. So I suppose in the EU 27 first off, and we group people in terms of the 1 to 4 in terms of left, and then in terms of 7 to 10 in terms of right, and centre there in terms of the amber overall of that. So you have about 1 in 5 would describe themselves as right-leaning across the EU 27 on average, yeah. So on average across, and the situation hasn't really changed yet year on year. What is interesting is there's different polarizations of this, so across different countries and that. So when we look at, I suppose, the more left-wing countries, they tend to be in terms of Sweden, the Netherlands and Spain coming through, whereas more right-leaning, a little bit higher proportions in the populations tend to come from, I suppose, Finland and Latvia, and in terms of Bulgaria as well. What is interesting was when you look at it and compare to Ireland, yeah. So again, not much changed year on year. But what it shows is that the Irish public have a much more centrist approach to politics and that. And we're the most centrist nation within the EU 27 and that. You know, it's always a startling figure when every time you pull it up, and we have been throughout our history and that, you know. So we're quite different, I suppose, in terms of the average in Europe overall, and that. And that's important because that plays into, I suppose our reaction to Europe, positivity towards Eurozone, and so forth and that. Then we ask and we talk about energy, and to what extent, I suppose, people agree or disagree, and these are agreement levels and that. Yeah, the top bar relates to EU 27, and then the Ireland figures are in the dark blue bar underneath of that. You know, and I suppose what we see is both Irish and also the EU public, yeah, largely in agreement with reducing the EU's reliance on Russian sources of energy, and indeed in terms of investing, I suppose, in renewable energy sources and that. And you can see in terms of the Irish figures, we show even a slightly higher level of agreement throughout with those particular figures and that. So we edge ahead in terms of that to reduce, I suppose, our dependency, but also then investing in terms of renewable energies such as wind and solar power, but also in terms of in the long run, I suppose these sort of sources can limit the price we pay for our energy consumption as well in that. So very much in tune, I suppose, with the direction of traffic in this particular regard in that. Then we focus on media for the last section on that. So the first one is we ask again to what extent they agree or disagree with various statements and that overall on that. So what we see, I suppose, overall is that the Irish public are more likely to view their media as trustworthy, first off. So if you look at the bottom two statements there, you can see 74% of Irish public would view the Irish media provide trustworthy information, which is a marked stark difference, much higher than the EU average in that, and also that the Irish media provide information free from political or commercial pressure as well. So those bottom two statements overall on that. Yeah. There is an acknowledgement, as you can see as well, that amongst the EU across the EU average, and also in terms of Ireland, and that there is, I suppose, news or information that can misrepresent, I suppose, reality, or even or is even false, and is a problem for democracy in general and that. So there's an acknowledgement across Europe in terms of that, and indeed that the existence of news or information that misrepresent reality or even or is even false is a problem in, I suppose, Ireland and that, albeit just a little bit less, and that goes back to, I suppose, the standing, I suppose, of the national media in Ireland amongst the Irish public and that. But I suppose, what is interesting is, the Irish public do acknowledge, that, you can often still come across news or information that you believe misinterprets reality or is even false. So they do acknowledge that exists out there and that, overall, but they feel it's pretty much easier to identify that news or information that they believe can misrepresent reality or even falseness and that. So acknowledgement that it's certainly out there, but that you can identify it and indeed trust, I suppose, in terms of the national media and information that is provided, which is very encouraging. Then we talk a little bit about sources, in terms of European political, news on European political matters. And then when people are actually looking for information about the EU, its policies, its institutions, and what sources they would use for that. So two slightly different aspects in that. So again, the top bar represents EU 27, and then the Ireland results are below that in the dark blue. So the source of news on European political matters, what do we see? So Irish public, a little bit more likely to source information from radio and indeed social media. local radio is very strong, obviously in Ireland in terms of international, but also in terms of the internet coming through, very strong in that. And I suppose we have to acknowledge, I suppose, the strength of television still coming through, albeit a little bit stronger in terms of from the EU 27 on average of that, but still very strong in terms of Ireland there, in terms of a second place in that. We have a total internet score there for Ireland around 62% on that, which is made up of everything from podcasts to blogs to information websites and so forth on that. But radio and I suppose the internet would over-index a little bit more, but let's not forget, I suppose, the power of television, news channels and generalist channels as well in terms of contributing to source of news on European political matters. And then we would turn to, I suppose, the source of information about the EU itself, and that, what do we see in that coming through? So we see again the internet coming through quite strongly in that, and also in terms of television, radio and press, so more traditional sort of sources overall. And then in terms of information around websites, information on websites would come in about third place in that coming through. Interesting, a little bit more discussion with relatives and friends for the EU 27 on average than in terms of the Irish population, where there's a little bit more reliance, I suppose, on online sort of side of things, closely followed by, I suppose, television, radio and traditional press as well. So, to sum up a couple of key insights in that, if we focus in on trust in European institutions and EU direction for the future in that, what do we see? So the Irish public, we continue to hold a positive view of the EU. We have the majority, we have 3 in 4, basically hold a very or fairly positive image of the EU in general in that. And that's been very strong, as we mentioned, over the years, and since COVID has actually it increased during COVID and has maintained that sort of level, and actually increased in terms of the last year slightly. Positivity is slightly lower amongst those who view themselves a little bit more blue collar or working class compared to more middle class cohorts, which would have a slightly higher view and positivity rate. About 3 in 5 of the Irish public would trust both the European Union and the European Parliament in that, and just under 3 in 5 would trust the European Commission, the European Central Bank and the European Council in that. And I suppose generally the trust in terms of the European institutions, that's remained pretty steady compared to last year in terms of June 2022 when it was last asked. Majority, but 3 in 5, would believe that they are well informed about European matters in Ireland, and that's actually up, so it's actually increased from 2022 in that. And our level of knowledge in European matters is significantly higher compared to European average, which stands at about a third overall on average across the EU. That only Luxembourg, the population would perceive a higher perceived knowledge overall at 69% in that. And the Irish public are also the most optimistic about the future of the EU as well in that. And we rank the highest amongst all EU 27 states in terms of that. We've over 4 in 5 of our population citing their optimism and that. Yes, when we look into the demographics, under 25s might indicate a slightly lower level of optimism, but it's still very high at 3 and 4, to be honest, overall. Then we talk about local and EU concerns. So when we focus in on concerns related to Irish society, housing comes up, top, and also I suppose the cost of living and generally prices. And that there's a clear defining issues at the moment in that. Housing is much less of an issue amongst the EU 27, so only about 8% on average would mention that. Now I know each country, different countries have idiosyncrasies in that, but it's about 8% overall across the EU 27 on average would be a key issue in that. So we are markedly different in that regard in that. And when we focus on the cost of living, we see the Irish public sort of fall in line, I suppose, with the EU average in that. Health is tied is the fourth most important for EU 27 members on average in that. Then we focus on issues, I suppose, facing the EU, so we look a bit more outward to the EU in that. At the moment, I suppose, across the EU 27, average rising prices, inflation, the cost of living would be the dominant issue that Irish people feel that is there. The international situation, followed by energy supply and then climate change. So they would be the top issues that would dominate in that. The Irish public would focus a little bit more on rising prices, inflation, cost of living, and then the international situation, and also immigration as well would be more prominent in their eyes as a European issue coming through in Irish eyes and that, you know. And energy supply, as you said, makes up the top four for the European issues for the Irish public. Then we turn to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the Irish public, so when we talk to Irish people, they're much more satisfied with both their governments, the governments, and also the EU's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine compared to the EU average in that. So we've over 3 in 4 of the Irish public satisfied with both, I suppose, EU and indeed Ireland's response in that, compared to just over half for the EU 27 on average in that. So markedly different in terms of that. And our satisfaction with our own government's response to the invasion, there's only 3, I suppose, EU 27 member states with higher level of satisfaction. That sounds around Finland, Denmark and Sweden, which would be slightly higher than the Irish public's view of that. And when focusing on this, only Portugal would rank higher than Ireland in terms of satisfaction terms. And amongst, I suppose, the demographics, the under 25s with some slightly less satisfaction with both the Irish government and the EU's response, albeit still 7 in 10 of them are satisfied in that. You know. Then we turn to public sort of political leanings. So, look, the rise of the far right has been, I suppose, a growing focus in Ireland and across the EU and that, particularly in the wake of different protests across Ireland and that, against the provision of accommodation for refugees in Ireland. So to put it in context a little bit about people's leanings, we see both in the EU and Ireland, there's no major movements in the proportion that would identify themselves as being more right-wing and that overall. So we see, I suppose, Finland, Latvia and indeed Bulgaria have the highest proportion of more right-wing identification in their population. Ireland, as we saw, is a much more centrist in terms of its political leaning. You have 3 in 5 of the Irish public still view themselves as centrist, compared to, I suppose, just over 2 in 5 of the EU 27 and that. And there's the highest proportion of centrist citizens, I suppose, across all EU 27 member states in that. You know, and those under 25, but not surprisingly, are much less likely to view themselves as right-wing. We have only about 2% who claim to be right-wing amongst that population, whereas it increased to about 16% over 55s and that, so slightly different as with the age bands. Then in terms of energy supply, and again that's obviously it's an important focal point of this Eurobarometer, and there's many more questions obviously within the document. We see, I suppose, both from the Irish perspective and the EU public alike in general across the 27 member states that all agree strongly, I suppose, that the EU should, I suppose, reduce dependency on Russian sources of energy as quickly as possible in that. You have 9 in 10 of the Irish public, you have over 8 in 10 of the EU 27 average, would agree that the EU should reduce dependency on Russian sources of energy as soon as possible, and there's clear appetite, I suppose, for renewable and efficient energy sources as well in that. You know, over 9 in 10 of the Irish, almost 9 in 10 of the Irish public would agree with that. And focus on wind, I suppose, and solar power and so forth and that. And when you look at, I suppose, the opinions across demographics, it's largely consistent and stable, so everyone's of that view, and when you tend to get to that percentage level, that's what happens overall of that. So good strong support there in terms of future direction. And then the final section, to sum up, is around media. So there's clear understanding across Ireland and indeed the EU that there's that misinformation and disinformation is a problem for democracy. Over 8 in 10 amongst the EU and also 27 average, and indeed the Irish public as well in that. However, I suppose awareness of exposure to disinformation is higher amongst the Irish public. You've got 80% agreeing they often come across news and information that they believe misrepresents reality or is false, compared to only 69% of the EU 27 public on average in that. And that's an important distinction to look at that. And when we focus on trust in the media, the Irish public are much more trusting of their national media to deliver trustworthy information. You have 3 in 4 noting, I suppose, the Irish national media provides trustworthy information compared to whatever 59% of the EU 27 on average on that. And then when we look at sources of media on EU political matters, it clearly illustrates, I suppose, the role of television in communication still. You have about half the Irish public citing TV news, just under half would note TV generalist channels as key sources in that. And not surprised, those sources tend to be a little bit more popular amongst older core society. But the other thing we're seeing as well is that social media is playing a significant role overall in that. We have about a third of the Irish population and just under a third of the EU 27 member states population would mention it as playing a significant role in that, and particularly amongst under 25s, as you expect. So that goes up to about 2/3 of those under 25, and that so as being the number one source of EU political matter information amongst that particular age cohort overall of that. And also, then interesting when we focus on sourcing information for the EU, its policies and its institutions, so focusing on that, we see that, again, while TV and traditional sort of media sources, they maintain their dominance overall of that for both the Irish public and indeed, I suppose, the EU 27. The role, I suppose, of social media is actually increasing as well in that. So it decreases a little bit. For as a source of information for the EU, its policies and institutions, whereas we're seeing it's growing more as a role just overall in terms of EU political matters and that. So slightly different overall on that. So hopefully that gives you a synopsis of the report, and we'd be delighted to take any questions.
Thank you so much for that, Luke. I mean, just to stress that BNA did the field work, but also did the report. So you crunched the data, in fact. And if you saw on the slides there earlier, there was reference to numbers and questions and things like that. So exactly the same questions were asked in each of the member states, which were the subject of the survey. So this is why it's a very interesting survey, because you can then compare what happens in different member states. So what we're going to do now is we're going to ask some questions, Luke, if that's okay with you. So we're going to start here with the audience, and then we'll move on to the questions that are coming in online. But we start here with Polish Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. Impressive results. Congratulations to Ireland on the 50th anniversary of the EU membership. And personally, I was very happy to see the results, because Poland was always behind Ireland in terms of optimism and the level of information. And there was another category where we were very close to each other. I was wondering if you asked about the impact of Brexit and all those problems related to negotiations concerning the protocol on the level of the Irish support for the EU membership.
Not directly. There's other surveys that we would do, but undoubtedly it does impact. In terms of the EU positivity, in terms of why Ireland has a positive image of the EU, there's a number of different factors, and I suppose the Brexit negotiations and the EU support within those would obviously be a contributing factor, as well as other more broader issues as well on that. So it does impact in terms of that.
And I guess that the fact that this is a Europe-wide survey and Brexit wouldn't be that interesting maybe to certain other member states. We don't ask a generic question about Brexit in the Eurobarometer.
Not in this particular one, yeah. So, but look, it is undoubtedly behind does in fact impact as well overall in terms of positivity towards the EU.
Because of the way that the EU was seen to support Ireland when it came to Brexit.
That's exactly it. So being part of the larger group, the wider network, has obviously helped Ireland, and just an acknowledgement of that and appreciation of the Irish population.
Okay, while you here in the audience, by the way, the survey for those in the audience is available. We have copies of it here. It's also on our website. And if you go and Google the Eurobarometer, you can check for every single member state. There's a similar report that's been done. It just so happens that BNA are doing the Irish report because that's their job. But other member states also have national reports, and you'll find those on the website. So if you can just turn to the questions, Luke, which have been coming in remotely. First question I have here is that we see once again that Ireland comes out on top as holding the most positive view of the European Union. And this has actually increased since 2022. What do you think you contribute that increase to?
Yeah, so I suppose it reflects, I suppose, probably a range of sort of factors. One is the response to, I suppose, COVID-19. As you saw, the positivity increased, yeah, just after COVID-19 has actually remained high. Response to the energy crisis as well would feed into that. Resolution of the issues around Brexit, as we talked about, would also impact there on that. And I suppose a general focus on, I suppose, social and economic justice overall on that. And I suppose the support for Ukraine as well on that, you know. So I suppose in turbulent times, you know, there's great comfort, I think, for the Irish population being part of a wider network overall. So they do see the benefits, certainly.
Okay, I have a question coming in here on Slido, Luke. It relates to the European elections, which are going to take place next year. And the question is whether or not you see any link between the data that you've discovered here, be it the positivity towards Europe that Irish people see, and perhaps the result of the European elections. Do you think that you can already gauge what the results will be in the European elections in Ireland next year?
That's a long way away, so I'm not going to start calling at this particular stage, but there's certain, I suppose, trends that we can see, as we can see in terms of the data there, in terms of the positivity that Irish people have. That's unlikely to change, you know, unless something drastic happens in the next 12 months and that. But I suppose what I would draw on is to look at, I suppose, in terms of the areas around energy supply, in terms of people's attitudes, the strength of opinion in terms of that. And also, I suppose, the challenging issues that Irish people see for the EU, which is a sort of a different sort of set of issues in that. And I imagine those sort of elements will be at play within the general election to a greater or larger degree. We have to see. It's a long time away.
Okay, you're not prepared to nail your colours and maths just yet.
No.
A lot more work to be done. Okay, another question that has come in here relates to housing, and housing obviously has emerged as one of the national issues of most concern at the moment, in particular because the government seems to be under daily pressure on the question of housing. And this comes through in the survey for Irish people, which is very much in line with the public discourse that we're hearing in Ireland. But yet, on average across the EU, housing is of interest to only about 8% of the people. You know, why is Ireland such an outlier, do you think, on this issue? You know, don't other member states also experience housing shortages, high house prices and high rents, etc.?
Look, I think the severity and complexity of the housing issue is somewhat unique in Ireland in that. You know, we've experienced a severe housing crisis in recent years. You know, house prices going up, rent going up, a lack of stock, some planning issues. All of these sort of have exacerbated the issue. It's part of the general discourse, yeah, that's out there, and it's a very, very topical aspect. The other aspect is there's a cultural aspect to housing in Ireland, whereby you know, people have this desire to own a property and to get on the popular ladder. It's a symbol of stability, a symbol of security for Irish people, and that. So there's that cultural and historic aspect which is quite different, and is quite a motive for Irish individuals. But it's we undoubtedly, I think it's the situation is somewhat unique in Ireland, and we have our own set of issues, you know.
Okay, just turning to another topic which has come in here. It's a question about energy, and only 11% of Irish respondents consider energy supply to be an issue of concern. So that's even down 4 points on the last survey, and this really seems to be at odds with the public outcry about sky-high energy bills that people have been experiencing in the past number of months. Why do you think this is?
Well, I think the key one is the supply, you know, so you know, as opposed to cost and that, you know. So we're getting supply, you know. We're not seeing necessarily issues with that sort of supply, but there's a lot of debate around the cost, yeah, overall, and that. So I think that there's that aspect, you know, in terms of what that figure is, and that, you know, and also there's been a number of government supports in terms of the Irish population and that, which has helped to soften the impact, albeit it's still quite dramatic. The other aspect, what we're seeing in terms of other work as well, that Irish people are sort of a battle-hardened bunch, you know. And people say, oh, after the pandemic, I said, no, go back to the financial crisis, you know. that some of the issues are still, legacy issues are still there. People are still suffering after that. So we've been through many testing times in that, and there's a sort of resilience. Nobody's happy about it, the costs and that, but there's a strong mentality to work through, almost fight through the issues and that. And as the more you live with something as well, the more you can become a little bit conditioned to it and that. So it's not to say that people aren't up in arms about, I suppose, the energy prices and that. It's still hurting people wise about it, but there's a resolve to, look, we have to get on with it and do it and that. But there's a distinction between supply and the cost there too.
Okay, that's an interesting take on it, because you would expect that people would be concerned about it, and particularly given
I wouldn't say they're not concerned.
Okay.
But I think they're nobody's happy about it. But there's a mentality to, look, it is there. We have to get on. We have to live. So there is concern, and it still is one of the top issues. The cost of living is still right up there, and a challenge for the EU as well. It's still right up there as one of the core issues.
Yeah, and when you were crunching your data, were you able to draw any link between the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the subsequent increase in gas prices? Do you think that has an impact anywhere in the survey?
Well, I suppose if we look at their attitudes to energy supply and where they feel that the EU should go in the future and that, it's certainly to not be dependent, I suppose, on Russian supplies. So they see that very much, but also in tandem with that, they see as well in terms of moving towards a more renewable source of energy as well. So they're saying, well, if you're going to move, let's do it in one fell swoop. It would be better for the environment as well.
Okay, good. We've got a question coming here on Slido, which sort of goes a little bit back to the previous situation in Ireland, in particular the constitutional referendums that we've had, and the fact that we've had two failures, two referendums failed in Ireland to do with European Union enlargement. On the one hand, you've got a high level of support for the EU. On the other hand, you've got people who are voting against treaty change. What do you think should be done, if anything, to pave the way for any future treaty change in Ireland?
Well, it comes down to, I suppose, information and engagement, and it's very, it's easy to say, that we need to inform people, but it's how we engage, I suppose, and we can think about the sources. We see there in terms of the study and what sources people use in terms of information, and how we can actually, I suppose, explain to them what is going on, why. Because if people don't understand or have fears that are not addressed, and we see that through various, I suppose, issues, challenges that face us and indeed the EU, people tend to get a little bit nervous and vote against or abstain or whatever it might be in that, So it's an easy thing for me to say, a bit more information, engagement across different sources and that, but let's use, I suppose, the information we have in terms of how we can actually get hooks and probably engage into the future a little bit more on that and why that expansion might need to happen.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the research that was done after the two failed referendums, people generally said that the reason they voted against the referendum was that they didn't understand the questions being asked, or didn't have enough information. Just before we move on to other questions that are coming in remotely, is there anybody else in the audience here today that has a specific question? Yes, sorry. The lady here in the third row.
I'm one of the trainees here at the European Parliament. I just wanted to ask a question about the numbers of data that you have. The EU 27, the 26,000 people that you're comparing the Irish data to, where are they taken from? Is that like an average from each country, or is there a certain number? Because obviously the population is so high.
Yeah, so it's literally the average of the EU, of the EU 27, so taking the average of all the nations overall, and that's what that figure represents, and we use it just to have a comparison benchmark. Yeah, obviously you can see it's an average, so there's high and lows between that, and that's why we pull out certain countries and that, and obviously if you go into the full report, as you know, there's lovely dynamics in terms of the full report, in terms of where countries are going and that into the future and that, but it's good to see where we benchmark against, I think.
Yeah, but just in terms of like the number 26,000, is that like from each country specifically, is there like 1,000?
Yeah, sorry, 1,000. Yeah, 1,000, and it might be one or two countries. It might be slightly larger than that, but just in general, it's 1,000. Yeah, overall.
Okay, but can I just ask you, just for information, you asked 1,000 people these questions, but before you ask the questions, is there some sort of process by which you reject people as part of the survey, or how does that work?
Yeah.
Can you just explain to us a little bit about how you pick these 1,000 people?
Sure. So in terms of Ireland, it's a random probability sample, so it's conducted face to face. So we would have a list of starting addresses that would be pulled from Auto Address, which is the supplier here, and they would be selected in proportion to the population, essentially in that. So it's geographically spread in proportion to the population. We don't set quota controls, so it's random probability. So in terms of going back to the households to get a representative sample of the population in terms of those particular addresses, done face to face on a tablet, fully scripted in terms of the questions and that. We don't inform them. It's on behalf of the EU, and that's important up front as well. So it's very often, sometimes you might see a survey and someone say, "Oh, we're going to talk to you about the internet," and all the older people say, "I'm not interested in that," and they screen themselves out, and that's not what you should do. You want to get people who are positive and negative in terms of their viewpoint and that, so we don't inform them necessarily up front who's on behalf of, to get a pure representation overall and an honest view overall.
Okay, thanks. It's very interesting just to know the nuts and bolts of how you set about identifying these people and then speaking to them. Another question which we have coming in here from our remote audiences regarding the support for the government's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Why do you think that Irish people are significantly more positive, that's 78% in the numbers, in comparison with the EU average of 55%? So why are Irish people more positive about the reaction?
Yeah. I think we have a strong sort of tradition of neutrality, peacekeeping, taking a stand on issues in Ireland and that. We pride ourselves being a small nation with a big voice in that, and I think we appreciate, I suppose, the diplomatic efforts to resolve conflicts, and there's a great willingness, I think, to support, I suppose, the government on some of those issues and that, you know. And the Irish government has been quite vocal in terms of support for Ukraine, and I think that's just generally being received in that. So I think it fits, I suppose, with our outlook, look overall as a nation, and really championing, I suppose, people against aggression and so forth and that.
Okay, thank you very much. If there are no further questions from the audience, I think what all that's left is to say thank you very much, Luke, for the presentation. Thank you very much for the report, which those people here will get, and it's also on our website. I'd like to say thanks to my colleagues here in the representation, especially Nicola and Katia and Roman, for organising this, and also our contractors for this event, We the People. So thank you all very much. You can look back at this event again on our YouTube site. If you go into euireland.ie, you'll find the report there, you'll find a recording of this event. So thank you very much for being here, and I hope that you've learned something today. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Very well. Thank you very much.